Yo, welcome to Six Slayers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike the Six Slayer, chilling with Mark, the honorable villain. What up, fam?
What's up, Mike? We got one of the greatest with us today.
We do. We have legendary creator Matt Wagner joining us. But before we chat with Matt, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right. Like I said before, we have a heavyweight in the game right now, known for his work on Mage, Grendel, Zorro, epic cover artist for DC, Green Arrow, and I love Batman. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Land, we bring to you the one and only Matt Wagner. What's up, Matt?
Hey guys.
Thank you for joining us, Matt. I'm a huge fan. Mark's a huge fan. Well, let's just dive right on in. Since it's your first time joining us, we'd like to get your comic book origin story. How did you get your first gig in pro comics?
Well, so let's delve a little further back. I grew up an only child, and I grew up kind of out in the country, kind of in the middle of Amish country in Pennsylvania. And my parents had moved out there, assuming their efforts to have kids weren't going to work, and they moved in, and she got pregnant like right away. So I grew up kind of isolated, and my mom was an English teacher and always encouraged me to read, and I drew to entertain myself because there wasn't a whole lot of video entertainment that day. We had a black and white TV that I think got 4 channels. So comics were reading and drawing all in this one tidy, beautiful little package, you know. And my mom was a former English teacher, and unlike a lot of English teachers of her day, she didn't mind that I was reading comic books so long as I was reading. She thought I would grow out of them. I grew into them. So I always knew I wanted to have a career in the visual arts, but you know, back in those days, before the days of overnight delivery, you had to live in or around New York City, you know, Jersey, Connecticut, somewhere like that, anywhere that you could get on a train, go into the actual physical offices, pick up your job in person, go home, do it, then bring it back in 2 weeks later, you know. I never lived anywhere near New York City at that stage of my life. So that seemed an impossibility. So I went to an art school in Philadelphia, and I met some young guys there. This is in the mid-'80s, and they were kind of at the forefront of what turned out to be the independent comics explosion of the 80s. They had this idea to form a publishing company, which turned out to be Comico, my first publisher. They gave me a chance to do a black and white book, which turned out to be Grendel. We did 4 black and white books, and unfortunately we predated the real black and white explosion that the Ninja Turtles kicked off. We predated them by just a couple of years, so we missed that tidal wave, you know. So of the 4 books that came out, Grendel kind of had the best reception, and when they had made a decision to move to color production, they had a book lined up by Chuck Dixon, who of course later went on to become a very popular writer in comics, and his then wife, who was the artist. They were doing a book called Evangeline, which was about set in the future and about a covert assassin nun that worked for the Vatican. So she's a nun, but she's secretly a Vatican assassin. So in those days, I don't know if this is the same anymore, but in those days, it behooved any publisher to do what they called gang printing, which meant that the printing press was so wide that you could fit 2 books being printed side by side. So it cost you as much to print 2 books as it cost you to print 1 book. So they needed another color book. And they, again, since Grendel had gotten the best response from any of those initial 4 books, they gave me the opportunity, and that turned into Mage. So Mage is rolling along, and I'm, you know, getting some attention with it and getting noticeably better with every issue. You know, my drawing got stronger, my writing and storytelling got better. And then some people started saying to me, hey, well, whatever happened to Grendel? You just kind of dumped it mid-story, you know. And so that's when I concocted the idea of reworking Grendel, the first Grendel storyline, to be a backup feature in the first Mage series. And so those 2 stories kind of appeared simultaneously and concluded simultaneously. And it was shortly after Mage ended that Comico came to me and said, we want to launch Grendel as a monthly. We want you to continue it. And I said, well, that's kind of tough. I just killed the main character. So that's when I kind of concocted this idea of having the Grendel persona be something that moves from character to character to character, becomes an inherited role, and just provided me this opportunity to continue reinvent the character and reinvent the storyline and reinvent the direction of the book over and over and over again. That's the origin in a nutshell.
Can you tell us how Comico differed as a publishing company while you were publishing Grendel and Mage, aside from Dark Horse and DC, the other two companies that you worked for?
Well, Dark Horse wasn't around at that point. And of course, DC and Marvel, any of the mainstream publishers, anything you did for them, they owned outright. No questions asked. Of course, the big horror story is that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, sold it for $125. All the rights. It was in the midst of the Depression, so they thought that was great, Went on to become a multi-billion-dollar character worldwide, The whole impetus of the independent movement in comics in the early to mid-'80s was intellectual property, owning your own rights, owning your own publishing rights, having control over your editorial control over your creations, this was predecessed by similar movements in the world of film and music as well. Of course, kind of indie music was really coming into its own in the late 70s, early 80s. And of course, indie film got adopted by the big studios, but was really coming around in the mid 60s to early 70s. So it was just natural that comic creators would want to enjoy the same sort of rights and the same sort of freedoms.
Matt, what are the challenges of being a cartoonist versus writing only or illustrating only, collaborating with another creator?
Well, I do both. I write for other artists, and the way I kind of came to that was, as I said, after I finished Mage and Grendel, the first story arc. I was pretty young. I was 24, 25, something like that. And oh my God, everybody was patting me on the back, and I was up for a whole bunch of awards, and luckily I was mature enough to be suspicious of that kind of acclaim, because I thought, I'm just a fucking punk, I'm just a kid still, I don't have everything figured out. So I decided to really try and just keep challenging myself all the time, And so when Comico suggested doing a Grendel monthly, I thought, okay, let me propose this challenge for myself. Let me try and write for other artists, and that will force me to approach storytelling in a way I haven't done up until now. I've only ever written and drawn my own stuff, So as a result of that, I adopted what is kind of colloquially known in the industry as Marvel style of writing. Not really a full script. And if your viewers don't really know what a full script is, it'll say page 1, and it'll break down all the panels by number, and it'll describe what happens in the panel, and it'll have all the captions and dialogue already written in. And it might even direct the design of the page, the flow of the action, all that sort of stuff for the artist. My thought was, if I'm going to be collaborating with another artist, I want that sense of collaboration. That's why I'm doing it. Morally, I can draw. If I want ironclad control, I should draw it, right? So the appeal to me was to be able to see through the eyes of other artists, get a wider range of my own visual possibilities, So I wrote in what's called plot and dialogue fashion, which would say page 1, and then I just describe what happens on page 1. I don't break it down into panels. There's no dialogue or captions there yet. There might be a line of dialogue occasionally just for emphasis. But then the artists would go in and draw that. Then their pencils come to me. And it was always so invigorating, because it's like, wow, sometimes like, that's not how I pictured that at all. And sometimes it was better and sometimes it was worse, but I had to make it work with my words, And so then I approached those pencils and I would write the final script over top of those pencils. Again, very invigorating process. I really, really enjoyed it.
So it was a way to challenge yourself as a creator, to make yourself more versatile. So that was the original intent behind all of this.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. Matt, you went on a very long, very popular Batman cover run during the early 2000s. How did you get that gig? And what is it like as an artist to have a catalog of Batman covers? That must be cool.
That is cool. I will point out I got the Batman gig as a follow-up to the equally successful long run of Green Arrow covers I did. And Green Arrow, I got that gig because Kevin Smith was writing it. And Kevin Smith was a big fan of mine from way back when. The first comics work Kevin ever did was for independent publisher Oni Press. And I, in fact, drew Kevin's very first comic book story. It was a wonderfully rude little Jay and Silent Bob story called Walt Flanagan's Dog. That was just a riot. You got to look it up. Again, rude as shit. It was amazing. So then when he got this mainstream gig to write Green Arrow, the editor on the book was my longtime brother-in-arms, Bob Schreck, who had founded Oni Press. So that's how I got involved with drawing that story for Kevin to begin with. And they came to me and they said, look, Kevin's going to write this Green Arrow thing. We really want you to be the cover artist. So I was originally only going to do Kevin's run. And how many issues was that? I want to say, let's say 15 issues, something like that, maybe 16. Right. And then Kevin decided he was done. And then they brought on Brad Meltzer to take over the scripting duties. And Brad happened to be, I live in Portland, Oregon, and Brad happened to be coming through town. Let me backtrack just a touch there. Brad is a New York Times bestselling author of political thrillers. Right. And happened to be coming through town on a press junket for his latest book. He said, let's get together and go out to dinner. Let's talk about Green Arrow. And he just begged me to please stay on the book. Please, I want you to do the covers, please, And he had a couple of cool ideas that were cool enough that I was like, for images, I was like, yeah, okay, I'll stick around for Brad. His was only going to be 6 or 8 issues, something like that. So then Brad's college roommate was Judd Winnick, who was one of the stars of The Real World.
Real World, yeah.
Yep. And I'd known Judd for years, and when Brad was leaving the book, Judd said to me, well, you're going to do my covers too, aren't you? So I stuck around for another, 10 issues of that or something like that. And by that point, I was just like, look, I've kind of had it with Green Arrow. Bob, do you have another cover gig that you'd like me to, lend my talents to? And he said, well, how about Batman? I said, yeah, that sounds good to me.
We were wondering, what book, when you were growing up, did you think would make a great graphic novel one day, whether it be fiction or nonfiction?
I never really had that impulse, and one of the reasons was she was very open about the sort of comics she would buy me, but again, I lived kind of out in the country, and so all you had access to was your local drugstore's spinner rack. You couldn't count on getting the next issue every time. It was very, very hit and miss. But in those days, at the point of purchase next to the cash register on the way out of the grocery store, where now they have the National Enquirer and Us magazine and all that shit, they would have a rack of Classics Illustrated comics. And she would buy me those all the time. So I never really had that impulse because I was getting those books already. So those comics were my first exposure to Shakespeare and Charles Dickens and Robert Louis Stevenson and Alexander Dumas and all this kind of stuff. And boy, I read a lot of those. But I will point to a book that I read when I was in junior high school, which was called Grendel. And it was a novel by a fellow named John Gardner, and it was the story of Beowulf told from the point of view of the monster. And that just kind of threw me, it was sympathetic to the monster, and that kind of threw me on its ear that, wow, here's this, you can do stories like that? You can do stories not told with the good guy as the main guy, So that was the beginning of my fascination with that kind of thing, I would say it was later solidified when I was in high school, when a friend of mine turned me on to the work of Michael Moorcock, specifically the Elric saga. Because, Elric's this fascinating character that you root for and everything, but he's quite the anti-hero. He does a whole lot of horrible shit, and he ends up ultimately killing everybody that's ever been dear to him, So that too really influenced me that tragedy was a good way to tell a story, not always having the good guy win. Because of course, you love these stories of heroic fulfillment when you're younger. As you start to get older, you look around and you realize good guys don't always win. Right. Get away with a lot of horrible crap, So yeah, and between Mage and Grendel, I kind of cover both bases. Grendel's my dark and cynical outlook on the world, and Mage is my hopeful outlook on the world. You know, I always say Mage is about growing up whether you want to or not, and Grendel is about great potential that always atrophies and comes to nothing.
We noticed that the first few issues of Grendel have a lot of manga influence. Can you... Is that true that you're anime
In point
fan?
of fact, I am not a big anime fan.
No?
But
influenced by
anime was
manga?
kind of brand new to these shores at that point. You know, it was this new oddball thing. You know, I remember particularly liking Captain Harlock, the space pirate.
Mhm.
It was just such a new and unusual looking way of drawing that I tried it out. You know, I ultimately abandoned it after the first several issues. I just didn't feel it was working out for me. So at this point, I'm not a gigantic anime fan. There's certain stuff I like. Like I was a real big fan of this movie from the 90s called Ninja Scroll.
Ninja Scroll was woo.
Yeah, really great, brutal, fun storyline. And then most recently, big fan of the Netflix series Blue Eye Samurai. Just
Okay.
fantastic story. And I
watching
wouldn't
that
even
too,
really
yeah.
classify it as anime. It doesn't bear the classic anime design motifs, you know, the great big eyes and little tiny mouth and that sort of thing. But it is, you know, set in Japan and has a certain design motifs that are similar. But yeah, it was just something I tried, and again, anime was super rare, and as a result of being so rare, it was enticing, you know, back in those days.
Well, Matt, I want to ask this question to you again. This question I asked you back in Memphis, because now we have better audio. That's
Sure.
atmospheric. Okay, so back in Memphis, I asked you about your comic book collaboration with filmmaker Quentin Tarantino. Could you reiterate your experience making Django Zorro with Quentin Tarantino, please?
Sure. So I had been a Zorro fan since way back when. When I was a teenager, we lived in an area. We had moved kind of from the kind of rural, remote area I lived to a more suburban area in Wilmington, Delaware. And we got UHF stations. Boy, that dates me right there. And one of them had on Sunday nights a silent film theater. So they'd play silent films. And that's where I first got to see Douglas Fairbanks' original Mark of Zorro. And it's fantastic. I just loved it. And then, of course, there was the Disney show with Guy Williams. So I've always just loved Zorro. And the more, you know, the more you realize what an influence the character was on Batman, it just becomes all the more terrific. You know, I mean, he's an aristocrat who fights crime at night, wearing dark. He has a special black means of transportation. You know, it's a fiery horse as opposed to a fiery car. He has a secret cave underneath his mansion. He has a manservant who helps him. You know, it's Batman without the bats. You know,
Right.
and you know, I mean. The terrific motif of carving the Z. I mean, holy shit, it's just packed. And so when Dynamite Comics got the rights, they had just come off, or they were still doing, but they had just had a lot of success with a kind of contemporary updating of the Lone Ranger, which I thought was really a good approach. It kind of brought the character to a modern audience, had terrific covers by John Cassaday. So when I saw they got the rights to Zorro, I've known the publisher of Dynamite since he was quite young, when we were both back in Philadelphia. And I contacted Nick Barucci and I said, "Hey man, let me be your cover artist on Zorro, the way Cassaday's doing on Lone Ranger." And he came back to me and he said, well, yeah, okay, that'd be great, but would you be interested in writing it as well? And so I had just recently read a book called Zorro by famous Spanish-American author Isabel Allende. And I would recommend this book to anybody. It's a fantastic, very literate novel about Zorro. And of course, written by a Spanish-American author, so it has an authenticity to it that really resonates. And we were able to use, since that was copyrighted to Zorro Productions, we were able to use that book and cherry pick the stuff that I really liked as far as the origin goes. And so I took to writing Zorro, and I wrote for almost 4 years, I think. So towards the end of that run, turns out Nick had been longtime friends with Reggie Hudlin, who has written a bunch of comics, wrote a lot of great Black Panther stuff. Yep. And he was also the producer on Django Unchained. And so Nick came to me and said, hey, we're talking to Quentin Tarantino about doing a Zorro Django crossover. Would you be interested in co-writing that with him? I was just like, that's never going to happen, but sure. And 3 months later, something like that, Nick called me again and he said, hey, we sent Quentin all your Zorro stuff and he loves it and he wants you to come down to his house next week. And I was just like, I kept saying to my wife, this is going to fall apart at any second. Like at any second, it's going to be like, well, forget it, didn't work out. So I was like, oh, okay. So, I mean, I even, I flew down to LA, I rented a car, drove up to his house. I'm at the gate of his house. And even then I'm like, this is still going to fall apart. Like I'm going to ring the bell and it's going to be like, hey man, sorry, Sam Jackson showed up, couldn't make it. Better luck next time. But nope, rang me through the gate himself, met me at the door, took me to see his comics right away, where he keeps his comics in his house. And so we hung out for 2 days, watching movies and in his private screening room and working on banging out the outline of this story. I was going to be there 2 days. There was no guarantee I was going to be invited back the next day because, I might turn out to be a dick. Who knows if we were going to get along, but we did. We got along famously. And so he said, no, you got to come back tomorrow, like before you fly out. So I went back to my hotel room and I pounded out like the first 6 pages of the script just so we were kind of on the same mindset and the same vibe. And he loved them. And we worked all day the next day too, up until I was like, dude, I got to leave, man. I'm going to miss my flight. And then I went down again one time else to talk over some other stuff. And that was interesting because we came up with this scene. We wanted to include this scene that was a scene that had been cut from the original Django Unchained, which was a scene with Django and King Schultz. Kind of takes place in the middle of the movie after they first become bounty hunting partners. There was a whole scene of them going to, I think it was Tennessee, to retrieve a guy. And of course, King leads them in this flamboyant, way that he does. And so Quentin said he had that scene written, and he writes everything longhand to begin with on big legal pads, before he has it transcribed. He said, yeah, I have it around here somewhere. I'll send it to you. Well, he never sent it to me. But luckily, as we're talking about it, he got up and acted out the whole scene, like, played every person's part. So I remembered it enough that I could reconstruct it on my own, and it worked out great.
Did he ever get any feedback from him after?
Oh yeah, he loved it. He loved it. Yep. It all worked out terrifically.
Matt, you've worked on some of the most iconic pulp characters: Batman, the Shadow, the Spirit, and Zorro. What specifically draws you to work on to these characters?
I like the time frame. I gotta say these I'm of a firm opinion that almost every pop culture character works absolutely best in the time and place it was created, with the technology and the societal mindset that it was created. There's, they keep trying to update this, but there's no way Batman could exist nowadays, with TMZ, a billionaire couldn't run around at night doing all this shit, and with everybody carrying a camera in their pocket at all times, Additionally, Batman has transmorphed as a result of current technology. He's no longer just disguised to scare crooks at night. He's a paramilitary character now, and there's nothing of that in the original version. None. He's got some better weaponry than the cops and the crooks, but it's not like it is now. Similarly, I always point to the Shadow as a real example of that, because the Shadow only works in a time and place when every man on the street had a hat on, right? Because otherwise you're like, hey, who's that moron in the hat? Why is he wearing that big floppy hat? It also only works in a time and place when major cities still had shadows, because I don't know when the last time you guys were in New York City, but it's lit up like a pinball machine everywhere you look. There's not a shadow to be found anywhere. James Bond, they keep updating James Bond. I want James Bond back in the 60s with the Cold War and with the crazy sexism and racism, and that's how it works. It doesn't trying to clean it up is not really the point. Make up new shit. Don't do this stuff. So those pulp characters, what I love about them is how they really fit into their time and place. and how kind of pure and unfiltered they are. They were doing this in a time and place where these adventure motifs weren't really established yet. They weren't really set. Especially the very early comic books. They're drawing their inspiration from the pulps. And they're not those tropes that have become so familiar in almost every comic character's story aren't set in stone yet. Another thing I worked on for a long time was Sandman Mystery Theater for Vertigo, which reinterpreted the Golden Age Sandman in kind of a contemporary crime noir sort of setting. But we took a lot of the stuff directly from the original Golden Age stories. Specifically, there's a motif that we tied it into Neil Gaiman's Sandman. Neil had actually tied it in the first issue of the original Sandman. The fact that Morpheus, the Sandman, has been magically imprisoned for like 6 decades, and his dream self invades Wesley Dodd's dreams, and that's what causes Wesley to go out at night and pursue criminals. And that gas mask he wears looks kind of like Morpheus's helmet, and so we had in that storyline, whenever he would go out at night, he had this little like voodoo doll effigy of himself that he would tuck into bed when he became the Sandman. And he would tip his hat to it and say, "Good night, Mr. Wesley Dodds," as he went out, like he was leaving his civilian self behind. That's in the first original Golden Age story. And when I read that, I was like, holy shit, that's too weird and great. We have to keep that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, they're just very unfiltered and pure in their story motifs, and just love them.
I hear you, Matt. Make up new shit, man.
Yep.
God, stop remixing and flipping and bouncing. All right, so we were talking about your cover runs, and I love the story, and we didn't realize that they were so interconnected. What is it like going on a cover run? How much of the script do you need to know? In this case, you knew the writers. So how much did they let you know in order for you to do what you needed to do?
Almost none. Almost never got to read the script. The script was usually a little too late in coming by the time I had to have the cover done. Additionally, Kevin was still making films pretty regularly at that point, so he was distracted in many, many ways, drawn in many directions. There's a terrific story about this, and when you air this, you can look it up and include these visuals. So issue number 10 of his first story arc, which was the culmination of his first storyline. At that point, this book was DC's #1 selling book. So all I got was a description, and this was typical of when I was going to do a cover. I would get a 1 or 2 line description. That's it. All right, so we need the Oliver Queen Green Arrow and the Connor Hawk Green Arrow, his son, back to back in battle pose with their bows drawn. That's tougher than it sounds. When you have a character wielding a big implement like that, like look there, you can see how with my camera, the bow's off screen. And if I bring the bow on screen, where I'm holding it is off screen, So I got what I thought was a pretty good configuration of these two, that you could see everything and it was dynamic. And so, I was getting ready to paint it, but I didn't know anything else. Didn't know where they were, what time of day it was, etc. And so I kept texting, or at that point I was emailing Kevin and saying, "Kevin, man, I just need to know, what's going on, blah, 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 blah." His film Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back was just getting ready to come out. And so he was on a press junket for that. And of course, busy as balls, and didn't hear back from him. And finally it was like, I got to go on this thing, And so I made a decision. I put them on a rooftop. I put a couple details at the top of a roof and a tree in the background. It was nighttime, kind of cold fall colors, a couple leaves blowing by. Finished the painting. Literally the next day, I hear back from him. He goes, "No, they're still in that dungeon and they're surrounded by a swirling mass of demons." I was like, "Oh shit, what is wrong? It's completely wrong." And again, this was DC's #1 selling book at the time, so I was decided, all right, we got to get this right. So I repainted it overnight with a whole new color scheme and a whole new treatment to the background. So if you go and look up Green Arrow #10, that's the cover we used. But DC had also paid me for the other one, so they had these 2 different covers. So on an issue of Secret Origins, all about Green Arrow, they used the other cover, the cold fall colors, leaves cover. So it's a neat thing to see because it shows how drastically a color shift can change the atmosphere and vibe of any piece at all. You know, one's fiery and frantic, and the other one's almost like two assassins waiting on a rooftop. You know.
Matt, can you tell us what inspired you to create the semi-autobiographical Mage, and why did you end on Volume 3?
Well, because all great fantasy epics are trilogies, right? So I had an interest in Arthurian legend at a certain point, mainly through the interest of a girlfriend back in my high school days. She was really into it. I kind of inherited it off of her. And then I saw in my first or second year of college, I saw Excalibur, the utterly fantastic John Boorman film. Was really obviously struck by the indelible portrayal of Merlin by actor Nicole Williams, and so much so that I ended up naming the story after the wizard, not after the hero, right? So I had originally started, way back even before Grendel, I had started a story about the return of King Arthur, and it was completely different than what I ended up with. It was much more ordinary. It was much more fantasy oriented. The guy wore like a headband and had a cloak, and much more set in a fantasy sort of setting. And then DC announced they were going to do Camelot 3000 back in the 80s with drawn by Brian Boland. And I was like, well, there goes that idea. And that the Brian Boland guy draws a little bit better than I do. So then it came out, and I was just like, I'm not digging this at all. This is just, it's no different. They're knights. They're wearing armor, running around in contemporary urban settings. King Arthur was even dressed like Superman. He had his outfit was red, yellow, and blue. And so I started thinking, well, maybe there's another way to tell this story. And so one day I was out. I was living in Philadelphia at that point. I forget if I was still in art school or had dropped out at that point. But I was down near the waterfront doing a couple sketches, and one was a self-portrait and had kind of I looked kind of old. I looked kind of world-weary, I guess is the best description. And the other one was this sprightly character in like a ragged poncho that ultimately became Mirth, the wizard. So I decided I needed to personalize it to make it, that myths need to address, as I keep saying, the time and the place where they are generated, the audience they're going to speak to. And I didn't know any knights running around in armor with swords, I knew a bunch of guys in jeans and t-shirts who would just kind of, skirt around through the alleyways in the city, and nobody had a sword, but a couple of them had baseball bats stuffed under the seat of their car, and that's how I ended up going that direction with it. And I never realized what a strength that would ultimately prove to be, it's not an unusual occurrence for cartoonists and comic creators to self-create like that. Charlie Brown was Charles Schultz. That was his alter ego. I don't know if you've ever seen or knew Dave Stevens before he passed away, but he was the Rocketeer. He looked just like the guy, The list goes on and on and on. I even point to Jeff Smith is Bone. He's Bone. So it was. I just kind of stumbled into this classic motif that I didn't really understand at the time, but came to understand more as I went.
And so it goes without saying, Mage is the project that you identify the most with.
I always say, as I made that comparison there earlier between Mage and Grendel, another comparison is that Mage is me looking inward, and Grendel is me looking outward.
As you sip from your Grendel mug.
Yeah.
So last question, Matt. Is there anything that you want the fans to know that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, we have the new Grendel series is starting very soon. I think it comes out like next week. It is the first, it will ultimately be a 12-issue story arc, but it's broken up into 3 4-issue series. The collective title is Devil's Crucible. The first part is called Devil's Crucible-Defiance. and then there's 2 more with another subtitle as we go. It's a neat, it kind of shakes the Grendel setting, the futuristic Grendel setting with Grendel Prime and the Grendel clans, kind of shakes that on its ear. It takes it in a whole different direction, which is what I've just always tried to make Grendel to begin with, you know.
And this is written and drawn by you, right?
This is written and drawn by me and colored by my son, who's my regular colorist, Matt Wagner. Oh, and here's the other thing we didn't talk about. My big project with maestro horror artist Kelley Jones, Dracula. So we launched the first book last Halloween as a Kickstarter. Did really, really well. Then we subsequently, in fact, it's now been printed and is on its way to our fulfillment service. After the Kickstarter closed, the campaign closed, we made a deal with Dark Horse to release a trade paperback version as well. This will be the first of 4 graphic novels we're doing about Dracula. Kelley and I have known each other for a million years, since he and I both worked on the most popular of Neil Gaiman's Sandman arcs, The Season of Mists. Kelley provided by far the lion's share of the artwork. I did 1 chapter which introduced the characters that became the Dead Boy detectives. But we had always said to each other, hey man, we got to do something together someday. We got to do something together someday. And we meant something significant, not just a one-off of some kind, you know. Because we got along famously. We both love horror fiction in any form. And so a couple years ago, I had posted something on Facebook, and he hit me back with that same old, we really got to work together someday caveat. And I contacted him. I said, hey man, are you serious? Because I've been thinking about this Dracula project for a long time, a way to address Dracula. And if you're serious, you know, we got to be ready to commit like a good 5-6 years of effort to it, you know. And luckily the timing is right for him too. And so the first book is printed, and we're working on the second one, which will launch this Halloween. But the first book is called Dracula Book 1, The Impaler. And the gist of it in a nutshell is that, you know, every film version you see of Dracula, it's always like, this is the most faithful adaptation of the original Bram Stoker novel. And they never are, right? They never are. It's always like, nope, that's not, nope. So we really wanted to stay biblically close to the original novel, but not do the original novel. So Dracula, the neat thing about Dracula is he's an incredibly compelling character, because in the novel at the beginning, when Jonathan Harker goes to his castle in Transylvania, he's on screen a lot. And then when he comes to London, he's gone. He's hardly on screen at all. And yet he's become this just indelible character. I would go so far as to say he's the most famous character in all of literature. Literally all around the world, when you say the name Dracula, everybody knows who and what you mean. They know some version of who and what you mean. It might be the Count on Sesame Street. It might be, you know, the Bela Lugosi version, you know, very indelible version. Christopher Lee. The list goes on and on. The Francis Ford Coppola version, etc. So we are telling everything that the novel doesn't tell. The novel provides all these little clues and tidbits. And so we're telling everything before, previous, and around the novel. So you won't see any of the events of the novel. You won't see Van Helsing. You won't see Jonathan Harker. You won't see Mina and Lucy and any of those familiar characters. And yet we still see Dracula. You know, the neat thing about the novel is it's written in what's called an epistolary style, which means it's all journals and letters and newspaper items and stuff like that. It's not a third-person omniscient narrator. And the one voice missing from all the novel is Dracula himself. So ours is all narrated by Dracula. So imagine if it's, you know, Darth Vader narrates his own story, or, you know, Hannibal Lecter narrates his own, you know. So again, book 1 should be on in the hands of the Kickstarter backers soonish, and then I think the paperback version hits stands in October, right before we launch book 2 on Kickstarter.
We love that horror.
We love Kelley, man. Let me tell you, I am not kidding when I say this is Kelley's magnum opus. I think it's the best thing he's ever done.
Wow. Like I said, mine is blown. We got more Grendel goodness and a Dracula collab with Kelley Jones hitting the press this year. That's crazy. Thank you for making that announcement. And thank you for joining us, Matt, today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
You always have a home here on the Six Layer Station.
Right on.
Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is Six Layers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and Matt Wagner. We are out. Peace.
Six Layers.